Hey, listeners, before we get into today's podcast, I just first of all want to say thank you. This has been 5 years of podcasting for us, and I want to say thank you to those who have been here 5 years listening to us and those who this is your first time listening. It's been a phenomenal journey and a lot of fun, and I can't think of how else I would like to spend the next 5 years other than continuing to podcast and hopefully bring you guys some great shows and great interviews. With that being said, I want to thank today's sponsors, first of which is Pretentious Pickles. Our good friends at Pretentious Pickles, located right here in Plymouth, Massachusetts on 190 Water Street, have a huge variety of pickled items for your consumption. There's pickled beets, Brussels sprouts, carrots, mushrooms, cucumbers, you name it, they've put it in a jar and pickled it. They make a phenomenal product, and for the second year in a row have been won Best Gourmet Shop in the South Shore, Massachusetts area. So congratulations to Lorraine and everyone at Pretentious Pickle Company. And if you can't make it to their store, you can stop by www.pretentiouspickle.com and you can place an order online. They'll ship it right to you. If you're into pickles, you should definitely check that out. And today's second sponsor is Omio. Omio is a travel booking platform that makes planning a journey in Europe and North America effortless. Just enter your travel details and Omio will magically give you all the train, bus, flight, and ferry options for your journey. It's never been simpler to book your first real vacation of 2021. Best of all, using Omio saves you time and money. That's a win-win in our books. Omio wants to help you leave your house this summer by offering 5% off your next booking. Just head to omio.com, that is omio.com, and use the code OMIO5 at checkout. Valid until July 31st for new users on all modes of transportation. It's just the pick-me-up 2021 needs. Omio, plan, book, and love the journey. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back, Inebri-arts. This is Andy, the Inebri-art podcast, and I am joined today by Elias Rodriques. Did I get that right?
That's Rodriguez. Sorry.
Rodriguez. Sorry, I was kind of like going between the two, and I should have asked ahead of time.
I should have said that beforehand, huh?
Yeah. That's my fault. I'm terrible with names, but I apologize. Joining us today, and he's the author of All the Water I Have Seen Is Running, which is a new book. Came out, was it last month?
Last week, maybe?
Oh, last week. So it's even...
Oh, I guess that was last month.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, maybe. Whenever June 22nd was.
Yeah, last month, last week, whichever.
Yeah.
So welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Also, thank you to, my digital listener, whoever you are. So happy to be talking to you.
So tell us a little bit about the book and, so this is your first, I'll screw these up. First fiction book?
Yeah, this is my first book of fiction. Yeah. So the book, just as a brief description of the plot, the book basically tells the story of a young man, Daniel, who when he is in high school is in love with a girl, Aubrey. And then, he's growing up in this North Florida town that he desperately wants to get out of because of the experiences of racism and poverty. And also he's just a teenager, and teenagers are bored in small towns, and they think that they'll be able to do other things in big towns. And inevitably he grows up and gets to live in a big city, New York, and he does make some changes, but also finds that it's quite alienating, and then comes back home after Aubrey has passed away, and is sort of forced to reckon with what this place that he desperately wanted to and succeeded in running away from meant to him. He's sort of forced to confront the ways in which it still shapes him. And along the way, he's also searching for understandings of how he came to be who he is. So this means he's talking to his mother a lot. He himself is a Jamaican immigrant and is trying to hear who his people were, and is trying to understand how they arrived where they were in the world. And much of the story is that it's a journey from, wanting to escape a place to wanting to try to come to feel settled in who you are and in the ways that history has shaped you.
Do you think that's like a natural part of growing up where, I remember as a kid, I wanted to get out of I grew up in Massachusetts, small suburban town. There was a skate park, but that was about it for like
Yeah.
kids. And, you were always like, oh, when I'm older, I'm going to do this. So I'm going to do that. So do you think that's like a natural progression for kids to kind of like want to shed that childhood thing by just getting away?
Okay, I used to think this, and I think it's mostly natural. Then I've met some people who are like, I was really happy in high school and really happy with my family, and I want to hang out with my family all the time. And I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You never this is so fucking crazy to me. And not people who are like, I was really happy and I was living in this really cool place, London, and we were very rich and everything was good. It's like, yeah, I was really happy in my hometown in South Georgia. And it's like, what the fuck? I literally don't understand.
Huh.
But aside from those people who I think, are a minority and who ultimately I just fundamentally don't understand, I do think it's a really natural part of growing up. I mean, I think this is a big thing about being a teenager. I mean, one of the strange things about Florida is that you can get your driver's license quite early, depending on where you live. So, yeah, depending on where you live, what your family does, you might be able to get a driver's license as young as 14 if you're sort of like working on a farm, but otherwise, permit at 15, driving at 16. And in Florida, North Florida in particular, where I'm from, where the book is set, Flagler County specifically, which is between Jacksonville and Orlando. So it's like, a nowhere place between two nowhere cities in some ways. I mean, places that I really like, but that like the rest of the world, like if you had to point out Jacksonville on a map, everybody would be like, where the fuck is that?
Yeah.
But I do think that it's really normal for a lot of people because it's, you're like stuck in a lot of ways. You can't really do anything except what your parents are able to let you do because they have the car until you're, 15 and you're suddenly like, oh my God, I'm going to do whatever it is that I want, and you and your friends, you get the car and you're like, okay, we can go anywhere. And then you're like, oh, fuck, we have no money, because, I mean, maybe, you and your friends work like part-time jobs or whatever, but you really can't amass that much money. I mean, I knew folks who were like working under the table in construction and landscaping, just through like family connections. And even them, like they still couldn't actually make that much money, even though they were making what was like great money for a high school,
Right. Yeah.
And you don't really have that much shit that you can do. And you keep thinking because your world is so small and it's so circumscribed that there's something else out there, but in my experience, I also moved out of North Florida and then I was like, I'm doing like the same shit, I'm like sitting around talking, I'm sitting around eating, I'm sitting around drinking. I go to the beach less, which is terrible, and yeah, it turns out that like there's actually not that much that I want to do that I wasn't already doing in high school, which is like talking to people, being vulnerable, laughing, whatever, occasionally playing like a sport. But otherwise, like, yeah, you have this huge desire to escape kind of because you're like forcibly put in this position as a young person where you don't have much independence or control. And then when you finally get it, you're like, yeah, this shit's not that different anyway, Yeah,
it's funny. Like, I was recently dating this girl and her daughter's like 13 and was going through that kind of like, this sucks, I don't get to do what I want kind of thing. And I'm like, yeah, man, it does. Like, you are at that weird stage where you have more and more responsibility and you have more and more like pressure to kind of plan out your life, but you still have no control.
Yeah.
It's just a weird, sucky situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really strange because also, there are young people who do like lots of amazing things and lots of young people who manage to like do things that whatever we all recognize as amazing, young activists, what have you, Greta Thunberg, most notably, most famously, Malala, what have you. So young people are clearly capable of doing a lot, and then there are young people who are less famous, than the Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala, who are still managing a lot of responsibilities. I mean, at the least, many whatever young folks like have to like get themselves to and from school, have to feed themselves when they get home. I think also schools are really kind of treacherous places in a lot of ways, and so they're also having to make themselves safe, having to make their friends safe. Certainly, if you went to the high school that I went to, you'd have to worry about, fights, sexual violence, what have you, so you have to like find these ways to make yourself safe. And if you're lucky, you have friends who you make each other safe with in as much as you can. I mean, sometimes what that means is y'all are taking on each other's risks because there's not really like a particularly like safe situation for y'all, you
Right.
know. So young folks are like clearly capable of doing doing a lot, but they're not really taken seriously for that ability, you know. I mean, in some ways it's like, well, whatever, you don't have a job, so there's just not that much that you can do if you're like, you know, whatever, 14 and you don't have a part-time job. But like, even if you do, it's like no one really takes you seriously anyway, you know. So
Right.
it's like, it's a really like deeply infantilizing in a way that can be so frustrating. So of course you're like, I'm just going to run away from this place and go somewhere else. And ultimately, like, you go somewhere else and people are like, yeah, I mean, you're still not the CEO. I still don't, you know?
So how much of this is kind of autobiographical, because it seems to like hit on a lot of like key points in your own life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think what I would say is that, like, you know, my like autobiography formed like at best like raw materials, you know, like the paints that one might buy from a store, but you have to do a lot to paint to sort of create a landscape, create a portrait, what have you, you know. So for me, I think what this means is, practically speaking, I wrote this book after a good friend of mine passed away when I was in my mid-20s, you know, and that was really hard for me. It was like the first peer who I had been really close with who passed, you know, which is a kind of hard thing. I'd been to other funerals, but there was something particularly difficult about this feeling that someone had gone prematurely, you know, someone whom I'd expected to be able to see again. And so, you know, and I just got really sad. You know, I like watched a lot of TV, but that was really boring to me. I was like going to like, you know, my classes. I was a time that was also really fucking boring. I had, you know, a couple part-time jobs, those also bored me. Talking to friends, also boring. And I just kept having this fantasy of like, you know, I was living in Philly at the time, so I was like, maybe I'll just like go to 30th Street Station and get on like a long distance bus, which is a really strange, you know, desire, because buses are like kind of terrible, you know. It's like, am I going to spend like 12 hours on a bus and go to like, you know, Detroit? Like, what's the goal here, you know? And finally, you know, at the urging of a lot of friends, I started seeing a therapist, which was really helpful. But unfortunately, also more people continued to pass. And I sort of like kept confronting loss in a way that had been really hard for me. And my therapist was like, you should write about this, you know, in a journal. And I tried and I just couldn't, you know. I like wasn't actually capable of confronting my own relationship to this person who I missed, who I cared a lot about, who had passed. I wasn't really capable of even like overcoming the fear of the blank page, because I was just like, I don't actually want to fucking think about this. I want to avoid this. I want to not deal with this. And so in a way, I started writing about someone who was mourning because it was on my mind a lot. You know, I started writing fiction, but I couldn't actually confront this in nonfiction. What this meant was that like a lot of the writing of the book might seem autobiographical, but is actually like quite different from my life, you know, and from my experience, because I wasn't actually able to confront it directly. But for me, you know, fiction sort of enabled me to confront what I was feeling at a sort of angle, you know, at a stance. And so in a way, I was able to sort of process and confront and make sense of what mourning is like for somebody who putatively is like me, but who is ultimately very different from me, you know. And so as I kept writing, I started to feel better. And for me, I think that like, this is kind of the thing about fiction that's meaningful, you know, which is that it's like, oh yeah, you can do things with fiction that you can't do with nonfiction. At a sort of personal level, what this meant was like, I, as a person, I couldn't actually confront the losses that were amounting, you know, but I could confront a fictional character confronting fictional losses. And that helped me get to a place where I could personally deal with my own life.
Oh, it's really interesting to kind of use that as a type of, I mean, I always feel like this is a very common thread in the podcast, how, you know, people create to kind of either cope with, you know, their issues or their fears or whatever. So I find that like really makes sense that you kind of used it as a therapy, but it's not like, you know, it's parallel, but it's not the same. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, the main issue is that, like, you know, if I use fiction as my therapy forever, then it's like, well, either I have to continually be fucked up so that I can Or I like, become a like well-adjusted emotional person and I stop writing fiction,
Yeah, that's one of the there's a British show called Spaced.
Hmm.
It who was in it? Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. They did Shaun of the Dead, and it
Oh,
was
you're right.
their TV show before that. And they had an artist who lived in the basement, and he ended up getting in like a happy relationship, and then he
Mhm.
wasn't able to make art anymore.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they played it up for comedic stance, but I feel like that's kind of, you see like it happen in music a lot. There's these bands that struggle and work really hard, and struggle with addiction, and their music's amazing, and then they get money and they clean up, and then their music kind of really tapers off, and it's like
Yeah.
there's something about that, I don't know, that struggle that really makes great art.
Yeah, I feel like this is the weird thing about, I mean, music, people so often talk about the sophomore slump, where it's like,
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, that first album is like lit. And then, they like made a lot of money and they went on tour and they found out that everybody loved them. And then they put together like hackneyed garbage,
Yeah.
and that makes a lot of sense in a way, if in your personal life, a lot of your music is oriented around this kind of struggling and dealing with that struggling. And then you don't have to struggle anymore. And it's like, well, what the fuck is this? You're just going to write happy music all the time?
Right.
It's like, that's not why I wanted to listen to grunge or whatever,
Yeah.
And so it's hard, because it's also like, I mean, in a way, it's like you can't struggle too much because then the music never happens. You know what I mean? There's that, or you never get found or your life can't continue. Like there was that documentary a while back about a band called Death. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, no, I haven't.
Yeah, this Black Detroit punk band, or they were punk before like punk existed,
Yeah.
And I mean, the music they made is really fascinating and it's really good and it's really ahead of their time. And it's also like, yeah, I mean, their lead singer just died, it's like, ultimately, it's like you actually can't struggle too much, right? Because
Right.
like, then you actually can't make that much music, and it's like a really, yeah, it's a really, really tough position to be in. I think it's a really quite dangerous balancing act.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. I've always said, is it what comes first? Do you make art because you have a dark side, or do you have a dark side because you kind of live this weird creative, life? And I don't. It's the chicken, which came first, the chicken or egg kind of thing. I don't really have an answer, but it seems like a lot of people use it to kind of cope in the same way that you did when you were writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think also, when I'd already like, gotten a publisher, I by that point I had started to feel a lot better.
Yeah.
That this is related to what you're saying. So I'd started to feel a lot better, and then I would like have to, work on edits for this novel, and I would just have to dwell with this like emotion, because the protagonist is grieving for most of the book, and I was just like, I would start to feel terrible, I'd be like, I feel just like I was like 3 years ago or 2 years ago or whatever, however long I had been. But also it feels oddly unjustified because by this point in my life, I had come to feel grateful that I'd known this person instead of like pissed or sad or angry that they had been taken away.
Right.
So I would just sort of be like thrown back in time when I was editing and then sort of come out of it and feel like, what the fuck is going on? Like, why do I feel like this again? And it was really hard. I mean, maybe, yeah, I heard, from another friend who's a writer whose work I really like, Mark Anthony Richardson. He wrote this novel, The Year of the Rat, that I think is pretty underread. It's quite good. He had said this thing to me that was, it's like, well, the emotion makes the art, but it doesn't have to make you, which was a really, really important thing for me to hear. He was like, yeah, say a prayer, do a chant, whatever you need to do when you're done editing, but like leave the emotions on the page. Because like, if you want to write this book, more or less, you just have to survive,
Right.
and yeah, there's something really strange about writing in this way, right? Because it's like, even if, let's say, you had a dark side and that made the art, at some point, if you sort of like blunt the edge of that dark side, if things start to get better, the art can also be a kind of gnarly cycle that pulls you back into it if you don't have ways of, yeah, leaving the
Yeah.
emotion, what you need in the art, and not bringing it into the rest of your life.
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, that's what you're saying. that's probably good advice.
It was
Yeah.
good advice, but yeah, the other issue is like, well, I don't want to be too happy because what am I going to write about?
Right.
People
Yeah.
having a good time.
Yeah. We started shooting these YouTube videos, which are kind of like to partner with one of our other podcasts, and it's people sampling different cocktails, and they're like, "Oh, you always get like weird cocktails," and I'm like, "Yeah, no one wants to see someone go, this is delicious,"
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. That's all.
So I was just going to just kind of segue into something else. So now you live in Philly, right? Am I
Mhm.
um are you already planning your next book? Is it going to be Philly based, or do you kind of like, I kind of get the idea of writing about places you lived. It kind of cuts down on some of the research, like you kind of know what it's like to live there. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. So is that something that you're kind of considering in future projects?
I would really like to write about Philly. The main issue right now is that I can't really see it. I mean, there's something really helpful about memory, actually, right? And that it sort of does that first step of filtration for you. It was really helpful for me to no longer be living in Flagler County, to no longer be living in Palm Coast when I was writing that book, because it was like, well, what are the images that I can see clearly, and why are these places? Why do I remember these places this way, and what does this look like? That kind of really helps one give a sense of setting, but also the perspective of the book, like from whose eyes are you seeing this and how do they see this? That's really, really important. I would really like to write about Philly because it's a really strange place and it's a really interesting place to me. And aside from Flagler County, it's maybe the only place I felt at home, despite having lived in many places as a young person and as an adult. I mean, I was born in Jamaica. I lived in New York. I lived in Florida. I lived in California. I now live in Philly. I also lived, for a year. I did a teaching gig at a boarding school in Massachusetts. I've lived a lot of places, but I really like Philly, and it's a really interesting and really strange place. But every time I've sat down to write about it, I write too much and too little, so I'm sort of I'm obsessing over how people are walking places,
Yeah.
Well, you take a left on Lombard, because
Oh, I see what
you
you're
want to
saying.
walk on South because
Yeah.
South is too busy, and so you walk 3 blocks, or it's all this stuff where it's like, what the fuck am I saying here? Nobody wants this, these directions,
Right.
They go to a book for books, and they go to Google Maps for their directions,
Exactly.
and so that's one side of things. I just see too much and I know too much. And on the other side is that I know what everything looks like so well that I'm also not describing anything. I have kind of no perspective because my perspective is perennially changing, because every day I go out, I walk, I go to the store, I go to, coffee, whatever, and yeah, then I see things again, and every day I see things again, and that's sort of constantly effacing any sense of perspective that I might have about this place, which as a person is wonderful. It's
Right.
I often have this experience of walking down a block and feeling like, oh, I don't know if I've ever seen that before, which is probably not true, because it's well, I'm often walking the same routes, There's something to be said about the strangeness of the, what it is about the experience of seeing something in such a way that you feel like you're seeing it for the first time, even if you almost certainly are not seeing it for the first time,
Yeah. I was talking with an artist friend of mine who has a gallery just down the street, and I live in downtown Plymouth. And she was talking about a kind of like a courtyard amongst these buildings, and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And I've been down the street 100 times, if not more. And then walking, I'm like, "When the hell did that get put there?" It's so
really
weird.
strange.
Yeah.
There's one building that I've now seen for the first time. I can recall 2 or 3 times, where it's I'm walking down, 21st Street, and I'm on the opposite side of the street. I'm that's really strange looking. I had no idea they had this weird modernist courtyard in this building or whatever, and it's why do I feel like I'm seeing this for the first time? I definitely have seen that before, but that stuff gets in the way of you, in a weird way, having a perspective on a place. For me, at least, I think other people are probably better than I am at living somewhere and writing about this place, but I can't do it. I need a little bit of distance to see the forest for the trees, because otherwise it's I'll just write about every fucking thing I see every day,
Right.
which is like, that book's just going to never end,
And the only people who are going to dig that are people who live in Philly and be
Right.
like, oh yeah, that is 3 blocks. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I know that when there was, I can't remember what show it was, but there was a show on the Sci-Fi Channel that was supposed to be in Massachusetts, and they'd be like, oh, we're in, Weymouth, and they'd look out the window and there's a giant bridge, and you're like, no, you're not. That is definitely not,
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter to anyone else, just those of us that live here,
Yeah, it's really funny because every once in a while I will like, watch The Office, and then I will be like, this is definitely not shot in PA. This is obviously shot in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I've been to Scranton. It just doesn't look like that. It's like, what's up with this like weird deserty, like, like tree? It's like that shit does not exist in like northern central PA. You know what I mean? It's like one of those really strange things, where I mean, as a person who's like watching that shit, I really love it. But that's only interesting to other people who are just like me, who are like interested in The Office and have also spent like a weird amount of time in the Scranton, PA Greyhound station,
Right. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. Philly is such a cool place. My mother is from Philly originally. So I've spent a fair amount of time down there, and actually was planning to get on there last summer during COVID. Have you ever been to the Muter Museum?
Oh yeah, that place is creepy.
It is very creepy, but very cool.
Yeah, I went for the first time, and I was like, "This is scary." I was like, "I am afraid." I like there. It's really funny, because it's like there are just all those like dead bodies that have all the different whatever, like things that are so called like not normal or whatever. Certain things that like make it harder for people to live. And yeah, it's like you'll walk around this museum and there will be all these like kids and families, and they're like, "Oh, this is so cool," and I'm like, "I'm gonna have fucking nightmares." It's like horrifying. It's like like the wall of skulls really fucked me up. I was like, I've never seen this before, and also, why does this place have no explanation of how this man got a collection of 180 skulls? Like, what's going on here? People and just like picking up skulls.
Some of them were like really. Like that, I remember specifically like reading some of like the cards of like who the skulls belong to.
Yeah,
it really started to bother me because some of them are like, boy, 12 years old, and I'm like, oh Jesus, like I didn't like that. Really kind of hit home.
I mean, there's a bunch from like, also I remember reading like there are a bunch who were like specifically like criminals from Eastern Europe who had been like guillotined, which is really gnarly, and then also a bunch of people who were like in I guess what were then called like asylums or whatever, like the sort of like what were called insane asylums, and like it's just sort of like, this is gnarly, like just a bunch of people who were like totally at the whims of, in the case of children, like adults, or in the case of, people in insane asylums, like whoever is running that. I don't really know anything about like whatever, like 19th century, like Eastern European insane asylums, but like,
I'm sure they weren't a nice place.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I've seen The Crown, England, I guess, not Eastern Europe. Yeah. I know,
So let me ask you for a bit of advice. I am typically a visual artist, but I recently started writing. It has always been a challenge for me. I'm going to say it's undiagnosed, but in talking to other people, I may just have never been informed that I was dyslexic. So it's a bit of a struggle. But the thing that I'm struggling with the most is writing dialogue from a female perspective. Was that something that you had to do in your book? Have you done that before? Is that a struggle? Like just writing from someone else's perspective that is completely different than from your own?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I have a bunch of thoughts about this. So that does happen in my book. I mean, one, not to like spoil anything or whatever, but one chapter, most of the book is from the perspective of Daniel, the boy who's grieving. One chapter is from the perspective of a woman. And then, of course, there are just many conversations with women throughout the book. And I have sort of like a couple of thoughts about this, One is that it's just really helpful to read a bunch, to me, I think just being kind of well-versed in, for me, like what I was reading a lot prior to writing the book were just like kind of the like greatest hits of like, 70s and 80s Black feminism,
Yeah.
And that was really helpful, I think, for getting a sense of like what it means to be in a tradition that wants to represent a group of people as humans, as complex humans, as well-rounded, robust, whatever, not simply like objects or absent or what have you. And honestly, I think for that, it was just sort of like, you just pick up a lot of things, just sort of like osmosis-ish, I'm not a big notes taker while writing, though some people are. But I wasn't like, oh, to write such a character, I should do blank, like, whatever Morrison does in Sula,
Yeah.
But I just sort of like read a lot. And that was really helpful, I think. Some of that is that you pick up things. Some of it is you also gain a kind of confidence in what I think is also important, because ultimately, I think if you're vulnerable and honest and serious about your relationships with other people in the world, with other people who are maybe in some way like the character that you're talking about, maybe they share an identity position, whatever, then you can actually kind of hear those people if you're really listening,
Yeah.
You can hear that voice in your head, and you'll know you have it when the person is sort of talking back to you, so that's the second thing, which is effectively like, there are, for better and for worse reasons, and for good and for bad, there are all sorts of like artistic traditions where people just try not to give voice to people who are not like them, not because they're hateful of those people, though sometimes, but in some cases, not because they're hateful of those people, but because of a kind of respect for being like, I actually don't know this person. I was in a very particular position, what have you. To me, that movie, Roma, feels very much like this, where the maid is actually not given that much of a sort of like interiority. And I think it's meant to be done respectfully. I think people have reasonable critiques of this, what have you, but it's like ultimately, like, if you know folks, you can kind of hear their voices, you know what I mean, in your head, and you just got to write it. You got to like get to a point where you can like really be in it enough that you can trust that you can hear them speaking to you. I guess the third thought I also had is also just, make it real. I mean, like, that's the sort of like, I think that like, there's this bit, I'm going to sound so nerdy. There's this bit in Proust where he's talking about how like everything is autobiographical in the last book for artists, because he's like, well, it's just not autobiographical in the way that you think. You're not actually trying to describe an experience that you had 5 years ago, because of course you can't even really remember that experience accurately. Instead, what's happening is like, oh, you just were like, oh, how does someone look with a monocle? Oh, I know. Let me think back to that image of that one dude I saw with a monocle 5 years ago, and the way that the light shone on his monocle or what have you, And I think that is the sort of other thing, right? It's that like ultimately that kind of reliance on the sort of like real, honest, and vulnerable relationships that you've had in the past can kind of guide you through letting other people talk, and can sort of help give you the sort of confidence also that, they're robust, they're full, they're like contradictory in desire, they have many motivations, they have like fleshed out backstories. And sorry, this is the last thing I'll say, but it's like, if you say it out loud and it doesn't sound right when you're doing the dialogue, it's just not right. It's just not right, and you just have to like write it in a way that it sounds correct when you say it out loud,
Yeah. So I've been, for the other characters, like in my head, I kind of have like a clear idea of, I don't know, like I have like actors that I know who are like, okay, kind of that's the type of person. And so like this one female character is more ambiguous. Like I suppose that's what you said. It's good advice, because I don't really know who she is yet. And without knowing who she is, I can't, having trouble making her sound likable and real.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing too is that like, it's kind of fine if you write a bunch that ends up on the cutting room floor, like if you have to write a bunch to get yourself there, but definitely keep writing, and maybe, the more that you write, the more you'll be like, oh, to me, this character is, whatever, Kira Sedgwick in The Closer or what have
Right.
you.
Yeah.
I don't know why I thought of that show. Just a show my mom watched a lot when it was on TV.
Yeah.
So I just saw it a lot, I guess. But you know, and you just keep writing until you sort of like find those kind of touch points, and then along the way, you know, you can deal with editing and cutting out all the bullshit later. You know, I mean, kind of, I think it's natural for books to sort of balloon and contract kind of periodically, you know, and if you have to write more and you're still not there, that's kind of okay. You're finding your way there. You know, I mean, I think much of what we cut is essential to a story. It's just not the story that people need to read, in that, you know, it helps you get to the story.
Yeah. Is there one part of writing that you really don't care for? Like, is there, that's a chore?
It's a good question. I think editing is really hard, or like late stage editing in particular. Early stage stuff is kind of fine, you know, because you have all these questions, you're exploring, you're figuring stuff out. I mean, that can be really hard in and of itself, because you can feel like you're like, you know, swimming at the bottom of the ocean. You just got rocked by a wave and you have no idea which way's up, you know, but you need oxygen. That can be really hard, but late stage stuff can feel really difficult because, you know, as you go along, you sort of narrow in and you're like, okay, I'm going to write one book, which also can suck because, yeah, when you have a blank page, you're like, this could be anything, you know, and you have all this possibility, and eventually you have to narrow in on the kind of boringness of this being one book. Late stage editing I find hard because suddenly you reopen questions, you know, and you're like, I thought I figured this shit out, you know, and now I'm asking myself this question again, you know, and to me it can feel like whatever, having many arguments with somebody that you're dating with, when you're having the same argument. It's like, are we going to relitigate the fucking argument about the dishwasher that we had 5 years ago all fucking over again? You know?
Didn't we resolve this?
Yeah. It's like, I thought we were done with this, but clearly we, not only are we not done, we maybe will never be done. You know? Which can lead me to a kind of despair. I think that late stage editing, I find really, really hard, you know, because I like to feel settled once I've decided some things, you know, and it's worth knowing that ends, and it's necessary for a kind of confidence in the project that you're doing. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like everything is confidence, because of course, like if you're confident about something that's garbage, you know, you're kind of in a problem, you know, but like confidence can be really important to your own personal way of like making your way through the world, you know, that stuff I think can be really, really important, but it's really hard because you also have to sort of suddenly be in this position where like, I thought I knew some very basic things, and suddenly now I'm not sure if even the basis of this is good. So is any of this good? That I find really difficult.
Wow. That's poignant and more than just writing. I think that, you know, is this good, or is it me just kind of in my head making it good?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, certainly I feel like in life I have many of those experiences. I mean, like we're talking about, you know, where it's like, I thought I figured out how to manage my schedule, and then you miss a Zoom event and you're like, damn, am I 6? You know, like, am I actually not capable of doing like the basic task of managing my schedule and showing up to where things are? I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just an anxious person and I just think too big.
I'm telling you, man, like the last one I did, like I wrote Zoom 5 p.m. and it was at like, I think it was at like 1. And I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, that's not a time zone. Why did I write 5? It just, Like, and I couldn't process why I got from 1 or whatever time it was supposed to be at to 5. Like, it wasn't a time zone thing. And like, I just randomly wrote down the number 5 for some reason. And
yeah, when I wrote down Zoom at 1, I spent like an hour being like, how did this happen? Not 11 a.m., you know? It's just sort of like, yeah, it's so funny. You know, I mean, there are these really basic things that we think that we have together, which we ultimately don't, but it's just so important that we convince ourselves that we do, you know, because otherwise it's like, well, I can't ask every question every moment of every day, because then I'll just never go to work and I'll never get my paycheck, you know? Right. That kind of confidence in oneself is kind of essential to going on, even as it's ultimately kind of an illusion, you know?
And I think it's really natural. You know, everyone is so self-reflecting in the fact where they're like, oh my God, I'm so stupid about whatever. I remember I was helping someone put something away in like this little tiny cupboard, and it was a bunch of glass jars in a box. And I'm like, there's no way to kind of tip this into the space. And she goes, well, no, you take the jars out, you put the box, and then you put the jars in the box inside the cupboard. And it's so simple, but you're like, am I the dumbest person alive? Like, why did I not even see that at all? And it's just, I feel like everyone has those moments, and then they're just like, I'm so stupid.
I think one of my favorites of these is also when I like suddenly lash out at the world, which I think everybody does, so like periodically I like whatever, we'll just like have a cup of coffee and spill, a little bit of that coffee on my hand, on the shirt or whatever. And my, at first I'd be like, oh, I'm so dumb. And now I'm kind of like, coffee cups just don't work. That's just a bad invention.
Yeah.
Which like, honestly,
it's clearly not my fault. Yeah.
Yeah. Which honestly, part of me thinks is true. I'm sort of like, well, why the fuck don't we have bottles? I don't spill stuff on myself with coffee bottles, or with water bottles, But ultimately it's sort of like, no, man, this is on you, like pour some coffee out, do whatever it is you got to do, but just stop spilling coffee on yourself. You're too old,
That's awesome. Where can our listeners go to find your book?
Good question. It should be available, wherever books are sold, Amazon, bookshop.org. If you have a local indie bookseller, you can request it. You can also request it at your local library. And if you are an audiobook person, you can read it you can listen to it on Audible, which I really like the person who did the reading. So if you're an audiobook person, I would highly recommend that. That voice actor is really amazing.
So did you get say in who the voice actor was? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, right? Because this is my first book, so I don't really know any of this stuff, and at some point they're like, oh, we've got a couple like samples for you. And I'm like, well, why am I supposed to know?
Yeah.
I gave you the manuscript. Your job is the one to, figure out what's good or what's not with like the audiobook. I'm not a voice recorder or whatever,
Yeah.
But actually it was quite clear, like there was, one person where I was like, yeah, this person really kills it, and I can hear it through and through. And I'm really bummed I'm forgetting their name because they're quite good. But yeah, it's you have a little bit of say, I don't think you get to like, or I didn't get to, whatever, just like start texting people. I'm like, yo, can you audition for this?
I want Gilbert Godfrey.
Yeah, that would be awesome. One of the like really voicey, actors, Gilbert Godfrey, Steve Buscemi. Yeah.
That'd be great. So yeah, man, I want to say thank you for taking the time. Hopefully our listeners will check out your book, and I wish you the best of luck with the book. Are you planning on like doing like the whole book tour thing now that things are sort of okay?
I've done a couple of Zoom events already. I don't have any sort of physical things in line right now, but people can always check my website, which is my first and last name.com, eliasrodrigues.com. For the events listing up there. And then there are some YouTube videos of some recorded Zooms that I've done also, if you just search my name on YouTube.
Nice. Yeah. So thanks again. And thank you to our listeners, and we'll catch you guys again next week.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to anyone who listened to me ramble.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. You can find us on all social medias at Inebri-art or on Instagram at Inebri-art6. You can email us at Inebri-art@yahoo.com. And make sure you listen to the other podcasts on the Inebri-art Podcast Network, including Bar Talk, Old Colony Cast, Retro Redoctopus, America's Hometown Horror Podcast, and our newest one, Theme Park Legends, a podcast about working at theme parks. What else? And we'll catch you again next time.